The former Vice President of Zimbabwe, Mnangagwa, has addressed his fellow citizens for the first time in public since his arrival in the country. He's due to be sworn in on Friday as the country's interim president. He says he's keen on reviving the country's economy to maintain peace and stability too. He says Zimbabwe will cooperate with the regional bloc, SADC, and the African Union as well to stabilize the country. Mnangagwa was in exile in South Africa for a bit. He thanked the military and parliament as well for leading the charge for change in the country. In the meantime, celebrations do continue across Zimbabwe and beyond following the resignation of Robert Gabriel Mugabe as the country's president. There's been no word yet, though, on what exactly is next for him or his wife, Grace Mugabe. The 93-year-old ruled the country for 37 years. Most of the country, in fact, have known no other leader other than him, so they're quite eager for a bit of change. Now, earlier on in the day, Mnangagwa met South Africa's President Jacob Zuma. The incoming Zimbabwean leader paid Mr. Zuma a courtesy visit. The South African president at the moment is the chair of the regional bloc, SADC, and he has been involved in that capacity in some of the negotiations and mediation following the military takeover in Zimbabwe. South Africa is also Zimbabwe's largest single trading partner, so continued cooperation between these two states is absolutely critical. All right then, so with a mountain of economic problems in hand, and that frankly is an understatement, what are the country's options to realize its full potential? Let's explore that in a bit more detail with our correspondent, Farai Mokutuya. He joins us now live from Harare. Farai, good to see you. What are the country's options right now for sorting out its arrears with international creditors, especially the World Bank, the European Investment Bank and the African Development Bank, particularly as a gateway to getting credit and investment flowing back into the country?
Indeed, Rama, it really needs to win over those international financial institutions. Now, what you will be aware is that Zimbabwe had made some progress in terms of clearing those arrears. It had come up with a roadmap, commonly referred to as the Lima Plan, where it wanted to pay off, these debts, particularly to the African Development Bank and the World Bank. And it was looking to secure a more concessionary funds, which it would then use to pay that off and hopefully unlock some funding. So I think the first port of call is to re-engage and to speed up that process once again, but also I think to follow through on some key reforms that have been recommended by the IMF, which, despite Zimbabwe committing to, really didn't make key progress on. These are things like cutting its expenditure, particularly recurrent expenditure. That required, slashing its wage bill. There was, lip service to this. There was talk of cutting the wage bill, but it never really happened. The one time the finance minister approved, the former finance minister approved the dismissal of 2,000 employees. They were reinstated promptly by former President Robert Mugabe. He also suspended civil servants' bonuses because he said there just wasn't the money. That was also promptly reversed. So I think Zimbabwe now needs to walk the talk, to do what it's committed to follow through on some of these really painful but necessary reforms. And I think if it's able to show that it has the commitment, then I think it will get the confidence that it's required and people will come on board and support it, Rama.
Indeed, but also looking at more fundamental problems. You've got massive unemployment in Zimbabwe right now. There's this cash scarcity that we've been talking about for the better part of a year now. The lack of investment flows, capital controls and so on. Is it possible for the incoming authorities to solve these problems and get rid of the bond notes before the next polls are held, somewhere between July and August next year?
Rama, I'm sure they would love to say that they can, but the reality is I don't see that happening. I think, particularly when you look at the liquidity challenges, they are a direct result of the fact that production, there just isn't enough production. And there isn't enough production because, not enough companies are running and operating. Companies are operating at 30% of their capacity. Now, as long as our imports outstrip our exports, which is the current position, we will continue to have these cash shortages. And I think the bond note will be here for some time until we are able to sort that out. And I think going forward, I think what needs to be done is to bring in some sort of credit line to allow companies to be able to increase their productive capacity. They need to bring in new plant and machinery. They need to invest in new technology. Those sort of things, if done, will then get us on the right path. But unfortunately, it won't happen overnight. Once companies are producing more, then the jobs would follow, then the tax revenue will follow. So all the other enablers, such as energy, such as infrastructure, can be invested in, can be rehabilitated and improved. But it's a process. It won't happen in the next 6 months or 8 months before we go to elections. It's a long-term, it'll take a bit longer. And I think what's important is for the new administration to be realistic, to be pragmatic, and to communicate that, because I think that's where the big challenge is, that previously there hasn't been, there have been, very lofty promises that have been made, most of them unbacked by any sound, evidence or strategy. Now is the time for brutal honesty, Rama.
Indeed. Speaking of brutal honesty, though, and especially in the context of investments, can the new president, can he roll back these onerous local ownership rules, which a lot of investors have cited as one of the factors for why they're not putting money into the Zimbabwean economy?
Indeed, Rama. I think, when you talk about indigenization and the indigenization laws and these ownership laws, I think the biggest challenge that investors, when I speak to foreign companies, they say that they have no problem with indigenization or empowerment. The only problem and the biggest challenge that they've had in Zimbabwe is that there's been no consistent communication. No one really knows what the policy is. On one day you're told it must be 51% mandatory. The next time you're told that, oh no, a minister in a particular sector, you can negotiate with that minister and agree on a way forward. So it's been a lack of consistency, a lack of clarity on the policy, and I think that's what investors are looking for. Investors want clarity. Once they have clarity and they know that this is what it is, this is the law, they will invest and put their money based on that. Unfortunately, there hasn't been enough of that, and I think that's one of the things, talking about the brutal honesty, that's one of the things that the new administration has to be very clear about, that this is the policy. If they are to roll it back, then let them roll it back. Let it be put down in writing and paper as an actual law, and not just something that is pronounced. Don't make it a pronouncement, put it into actual law. Be clear on this policy, and I think once they do that, the investors will get the confidence, and then they'll bring in their money.